If you love gripping stories that pull you in and don't let go, you're in the right place. This is Mr. Gray Stories. There are moments in life that arrive quietly. No warning, no music announcing their importance, just a single sentence spoken at the right time, to the wrong person, or maybe the right one. It happened in Baltimore, Maryland. Inside a quiet restaurant near the inner harbor where the lights were dim, the tables were dressed in white cloth, and the air carried the scent of butter, garlic, and fresh seafood. Most people there that evening were focused on their own conversations. Business deals, vacation plans, small talk over glasses of wine. No one expected that a single word spoken at one table would change 2 lives. At that table sat a man named George, 38 years old, perfectly tailored suit, calm posture, the kind of man who moved through the world knowing doors would open when he arrived. Because George wasn't just wealthy, he was a billionaire. Across the room, moving between tables with a steady rhythm, was a woman named Catherine, 30 years old, sharp-eyed, calm in the way someone becomes after learning to observe people before speaking. She worked there as a waitress. To most customers, she was simply the woman bringing menus, water, and plates of food, someone easy to overlook. George glanced at her when she approached his table, and in that brief moment, a small thought crossed his mind. A harmless little test, at least, that's what he believed. So when Catherine politely asked if he was ready to order, George didn't respond in English. Instead, he spoke in German, calmly, confidently, expecting confusion. What happened next lasted less than 5 seconds, but that 5 seconds would stay with him for the rest of his life. Before we get into that moment, welcome to Mr. Gray Stories. Here we tell the kind of stories that stay with you, stories that challenge you, comfort you, and sometimes even change you. If you're new, go ahead and subscribe. You're exactly where you're meant to be. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room and felt someone make a decision about you? Before you even said a word, maybe it was because of your job, maybe the clothes you were wearing, maybe the way people assumed your role the moment they saw you. It happens more often than most people admit. A person wearing a uniform becomes invisible. A server becomes just the waitress. A cashier becomes someone people barely look at. And yet, every person carries a life far bigger than the role you see in that moment. Dreams, education, experiences you would never guess by looking across a table for 10 seconds. That night in Baltimore, George believed he understood the situation perfectly. He was a billionaire sitting in a quiet restaurant after a long business meeting. Catherine was the waitress taking his order. To him, it looked like a simple interaction. But what George didn't realize was that Catherine's life had taken a very different path before she ever carried a tray through that dining room. Years earlier, she had spent long nights studying languages. German, French, Spanish. She loved the way words could open doors into different cultures. The way a single sentence could hold history, emotion, and meaning all at once. Back then, Catherine imagined a future filled with translation work, international travel, and classrooms where languages were studied like living art. But life has a way of shifting direction. Responsibilities appear, family needs change, dreams pause while reality demands attention. By the time George met her, Catherine's classroom had been replaced by a restaurant floor, and most people who sat at her tables never asked about the life she had lived before that moment. They simply saw a waitress. But George was about to learn something many people forget. The person serving your dinner might know far more than you expect. And sometimes, all it takes is one sentence to reveal it. So here's the real question. How often do people walk into everyday moments carrying quiet assumptions about the people around them? A businessman assumes the waiter won't understand a foreign language. A traveler assumes the hotel clerk has never left their city. Someone sitting in comfort assumes the person serving them has never sat in a classroom discussing global ideas. Those assumptions rarely get challenged, because most people never say anything. Most people simply take the order, bring the food, and move on. But Catherine wasn't most people. When George finished scanning the menu that evening, he looked up and spoke calmly. Not in English, in German. Ich hätte gern das Lachsgericht und vielleicht ein Glas Riesling. He said it smoothly, expecting the moment to play out the way it usually did. Confusion, a polite smile, maybe a request to repeat himself in English. Instead, Catherine blinked once. She wrote something down on her notepad. Then she looked at him with the same calm expression and said politely, "Of course, sir. The salmon dish and a glass of Riesling." George froze. But Catherine wasn't finished. With the gentlest tone, she added one more sentence. "You might want to say Den Lachs instead of Das Lachs." That was it. One quiet correction. No attitude. No long explanation. Just knowledge delivered with calm confidence. And in that moment, George realized something uncomfortable. The assumption he made about the woman standing in front of him had just collapsed in 5 seconds. But that small correction was only the beginning. Because what started with one German word was about to open a story about respect, second chances, and a dream that refused to disappear. Before we step into the rest of Catherine and George's story, take a second to support the channel. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Mr. Gray Stories, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to Baltimore, because this story didn't begin with a billionaire walking into a restaurant. It began long before that, in the life of a woman named Catherine. Long before a quiet correction in a restaurant surprised a billionaire, Catherine's story had already been shaped by a city that carried history in every block. Baltimore, Maryland was a place of contrasts. Near the inner harbor, glass buildings reflected sunlight across the water while tourists moved between seafood restaurants and harbor boats. Just a few miles away, rows of red brick houses stretched down narrow streets where neighbors greeted each other from their front steps. It was in one of those neighborhoods that Catherine grew up. On warm evenings, children raced their bicycles along the sidewalks while adults talked across porch railings. Music floated from open windows, sometimes gospel, sometimes old-school R&B, sometimes a mix of both. The air often carried the smell of grilled food drifting from backyard cookouts. Weekends were never quiet. Someone always had a speaker playing music, someone always had a grill going, and laughter traveled easily down the block. In that environment, people learned early that community mattered. Doors stayed open, neighbors checked on each other, and children were raised not just by parents, but by a network of watchful eyes that stretched across the street. Catherine grew up surrounded by that warmth. She was tall even as a teenager, with a calm way of observing people before speaking. While other kids filled conversations with constant chatter, Catherine often listened first. She noticed things, tone of voice, expressions, the small signals people gave without realizing it. Her mother used to smile when she saw that thoughtful look in Catherine's eyes. One afternoon when Catherine was about 15, she sat at the kitchen table reading a book while her mother prepared dinner nearby. Catherine had been quiet for a long time, staring at a page without turning it. Her mother noticed. "Something on your mind?" she asked gently. Catherine looked up. Sometimes people talk like they think they know everything about you before you even speak. Her mother paused, then leaned against the counter. "That's going to happen sometimes," she said. Catherine frowned slightly. "So, what do you do about it?" Her mother smiled in that calm, knowing way that carried years of experience. "Baby," she said softly, "never let somebody make you feel small just because they don't know how big you are." Catherine didn't fully understand that sentence at the time, but she remembered it. Years passed, and Catherine graduated from high school with strong grades. While many of her classmates chose practical career paths close to home, Catherine found herself fascinated by something different. Languages. It started with a simple class requirement in school. German. At first, it felt unfamiliar and complicated. The sounds were different from English, the grammar precise in ways that forced careful attention. But something about it excited her curiosity. Words carried structure. History lived inside expressions. And the more Catherine studied, the more she realized language was more than vocabulary. It was culture, perspective, a doorway into how people in other parts of the world understood life. When she entered college, Catherine chose linguistics as her field of study. Her professors quickly noticed her dedication. She spent long evenings studying pronunciation patterns, translation methods, and the subtle differences between languages that most casual learners never noticed. German became one of her strongest subjects. French followed, then Spanish. Catherine loved the discipline required to master each one. Some nights she stayed up late reviewing notes while the city outside her apartment window grew quiet. She imagined a future where those skills would carry her far beyond Baltimore. Maybe working in translation, maybe teaching, maybe traveling internationally to study how language shaped different cultures. It was a dream built on patience and curiosity, but life rarely moves in straight lines. During Catherine's final years in college, Her mother's health began to decline. Hospital visits became more frequent. Medical bills grew heavier. Catherine found herself facing a difficult decision. Continuing her studies while her family struggled financially no longer felt right. So she did what many people in her situation would do. She stepped forward. Catherine took work wherever she could find it, balancing responsibilities while making sure her mother received the care she needed. The plan had always been temporary, just until things stabilized, just until life slowed down again. But time moved quickly, and somewhere between long days and late nights, Catherine's academic path paused. Not because she lacked ability, not because she lost interest, but because responsibility sometimes asks for sacrifices that dreams must wait to recover from. Eventually, Catherine found steady work at a restaurant near Baltimore's Inner Harbor. It was the kind of place where professionals met for quiet lunches and travelers enjoyed seafood dinners after long days exploring the city. Inside, the atmosphere felt warm and polished. Soft lighting, white tablecloths, the steady rhythm of plates leaving the kitchen and arriving at carefully arranged tables. Catherine learned the flow quickly. She memorized menu items, remembered regular customers, balanced trays with practiced ease while moving between conversations and orders. To most people dining there, she appeared like any other server doing her job. Efficient, polite, focused. But behind that calm presence lived years of study, discipline, and quiet ambition. And though Catherine rarely mentioned it to anyone in the dining room, the languages she once studied never fully disappeared. They remained stored carefully in her memory, waiting, like books placed gently on a shelf, ready to be opened again someday. Catherine didn't know when that day might arrive, but life has a curious way of placing unexpected moments directly in front of us. And one evening, during an ordinary shift at that restaurant near Baltimore's harbor, a man named George walked through the door. When George walked into the restaurant that evening, no one inside knew they were looking at a man who controlled companies worth billions. At first glance, he didn't appear extraordinary. He was tall, well-dressed in a dark suit that fit perfectly, and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who rarely felt rushed. His movements were measured, calm, the kind of calm that comes from living a life where most problems can be solved with a phone call. George had arrived in Baltimore earlier that afternoon for a business meeting. For years, his life had revolved around investments, technology companies, real estate developments, private ventures that operated quietly behind the scenes while generating enormous wealth. By the time George turned 38, financial success was no longer something he pursued. It was simply the environment he lived in. But there was something people rarely talked about when it came to extreme wealth. After a while, excitement becomes difficult to find. For George, luxury had slowly turned into routine. Private flights, luxury hotels, exclusive dinners, rooms filled with powerful people discussing deals that moved millions of dollars in seconds. At first it had been thrilling. Now it felt repetitive. The conversations rarely surprised him anymore. The deals followed familiar patterns. Even celebrations after successful ventures had begun to feel predictable. That evening, after finishing his meeting in Baltimore, George decided to skip the usual private dining invitations his associates preferred. Instead, he asked his driver to drop him near the Inner Harbor. He wanted something simple, a quiet meal, a moment without people asking about investments or partnerships. So George walked along the harbor until he noticed a restaurant glowing softly behind wide glass windows. Inside, diners spoke in low voices while servers moved gracefully between tables. It looked peaceful. George stepped inside. The host greeted him politely. "Good evening, sir." George nodded with a small smile. "Just one tonight." The host picked up a menu and led him toward a table near the window where the harbor lights reflected across the water outside. As George settled into his seat, he glanced around the room. The restaurant had an easy rhythm. Conversations flowed gently between tables. A couple near the center of the room shared a quiet laugh over glasses of wine. A group of business travelers discussed something serious while studying documents between bites of food. And the staff moved efficiently, carrying plates from the kitchen with steady coordination. George liked observing places like this, not because he was looking for anything in particular, but because watching ordinary life unfold sometimes felt more interesting than sitting in another boardroom. He opened the menu slowly. Seafood dishes filled the page. Salmon, crab cakes, grilled fish prepared with sauces that sounded both rich and carefully balanced. George studied the descriptions while sipping the water the host had placed on the table. Then he noticed her. Catherine. She was moving between tables with smooth confidence, balancing a tray of drinks while checking on a nearby couple. Her posture was steady, her expression calm. Unlike some servers who rush from table to table under pressure, Catherine seemed completely comfortable in the environment. She listened carefully when customers spoke. She nodded thoughtfully. She never interrupted conversations, yet always appeared exactly when someone needed something. George watched for a moment without realizing it, not in a rude way, just with quiet curiosity. There was something composed about her, something that suggested she paid attention to more than most people noticed. Catherine finished placing drinks at one table before turning toward George's section. She picked up a small notepad as she approached. When she reached his table, she greeted him with a natural smile. "Good evening," she said warmly. "My name is Catherine. I'll be taking care of you tonight." Her voice carried a calm clarity that immediately caught George's attention. Not rehearsed, not overly formal, just genuine. George glanced up from the menu. For a brief moment their eyes met. Catherine waited patiently, giving him space to continue reading if he needed more time. George appreciated that. Many servers tried to rush orders during busy evenings, but Catherine simply stood there with relaxed confidence. It made the moment feel comfortable. George returned his attention to the menu for a few seconds, but something unexpected crossed his mind. A small curiosity, not cruel, not malicious, just a passing idea that appeared because George had traveled extensively over the years. He had noticed something during those travels. Speaking a foreign language in unexpected places sometimes created interesting reactions. Some people became confused. Others laughed nervously. Occasionally, someone surprised him by answering fluently. George had no reason to think this restaurant would be different from the hundreds of others he had visited before. So when Catherine looked up from her notepad and asked politely, "Are you ready to order, sir?" George closed the menu slowly. Then he looked at her with a calm expression, and instead of answering in English, he spoke in German. George's voice carried the smooth confidence of someone used to being understood. "Ich hätte gern das Lachsgericht und vielleicht ein Glas Riesling." The sentence came out naturally, calm, practiced. George had spoken German in restaurants across Europe many times before. Most of the time it produced one of two reactions: confusion or polite laughter, followed by a request to repeat the order in English. So when he finished the sentence, George leaned back slightly in his chair, expecting the familiar pause that usually followed. Across the table, Catherine listened without interrupting. Her eyes remained steady. She didn't look confused. She didn't ask him to repeat himself. Instead, she wrote something quickly on her notepad. Then she looked up and spoke in the same calm voice she had used moments earlier. "Of course, sir. The salmon dish and a glass of Riesling." George blinked. For a brief second he thought perhaps she had simply guessed the order based on the menu. But Catherine continued. There was the smallest hint of a polite smile at the corner of her lips. "You might want to say Den Lachs instead of Das Lachs." The correction was delivered gently. No criticism, no change in tone, just quiet accuracy. For the first time since entering the restaurant, George became completely still. Not dramatically, just the subtle pause of someone realizing a moment had taken an unexpected turn. He looked up at Catherine more carefully now. "You speak German?" he asked. Catherine shrugged lightly, as if the answer didn't require much attention. "A little." George leaned back in his chair again, but this time the movement carried a different energy. Curiosity, because the reaction he expected had not happened. Instead, the woman standing beside his table had calmly corrected his grammar. Not aggressively, not proudly, just correctly. George studied her expression. Catherine's posture hadn't changed. She simply waited to see if he needed anything else. It was the kind of quiet confidence that rarely appeared in situations where people felt the need to prove something. George chuckled softly. "Well," he said, "that's unexpected." Catherine tilted her head slightly. Languages have a way of surprising people. George rested his elbow on the table, now completely interested in the conversation. "Where did you learn it?" "College," Catherine replied simply. The answer was short. No long explanation followed. She didn't mention how many years she had studied. She didn't list the other languages she had learned. She simply wrote the order down and prepared to step away. But George spoke again. "Wait a second." Catherine paused and turned back. George leaned forward slightly. Did you know what I was doing just now? Catherine raised one eyebrow. You mean ordering dinner? George smiled. No, speaking German. For the first time in the conversation, Catherine allowed a small laugh. If someone orders wine in another language, she said calmly, I usually assume they're either showing off or testing me. George laughed out loud, a genuine laugh that carried across the table before he could stop it. And which one was I? Catherine met his eyes for a brief moment. Her answer came without hesitation, still deciding. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen doors with the order. George remained seated at the table, watching her disappear behind the swinging door. For a few seconds he didn't move. The moment replayed quietly in his mind. He had walked into the restaurant expecting a simple meal, a quiet evening before returning to his hotel. Instead, the interaction had revealed something he hadn't anticipated, an assumption. George had believed a woman bringing his dinner probably wouldn't recognize the language he spoke, not because he thought badly of her, but because people often carry silent expectations about strangers they meet for the first time. Yet Catherine had corrected a grammatical detail without hesitation, and she had done it with a calm that suggested she didn't need recognition for it. George glanced around the restaurant again. Other customers continued eating, unaware that anything unusual had happened. Plates clinked softly. Conversations carried on, but at George's table, something had shifted. A small test he expected to pass unnoticed had quietly collapsed, and the woman he assumed he understood suddenly seemed far more interesting than he first believed. George leaned back in his chair slowly. For the first time that evening, he wasn't thinking about business meetings or investment strategies. He was thinking about a waitress who corrected one word, and the uncomfortable realization that sometimes the quickest judgments reveal more about the person making them than the person being judged. Across the room, Catherine reappeared carrying another tray for a different table. She moved through the dining room with the same calm rhythm as before, focused, professional, unbothered, as if correcting a billionaire's German grammar had been nothing more than an ordinary part of her shift. But George knew something had changed, because the next time Catherine returned to his table, he intended to ask more questions. For the rest of that evening, George finished his dinner slowly, not because the meal required extra time, but because his mind kept returning to the brief exchange with Catherine. The correction had been simple, just 2 words, Den Lachs. Yet something about the moment stayed with him long after the plates were cleared. George paid the bill, thanked Catherine politely when she returned to collect it, and left the restaurant like any other customer. But as he stepped outside into the cool air near the inner harbor, he paused. The harbor water reflected the lights of the surrounding buildings. Small boats moved quietly across the dark surface. George stood there for a moment longer than necessary. He wasn't thinking about his meeting earlier that day. He wasn't thinking about the investments waiting for him back home. Instead, he found himself thinking about Catherine. More specifically, the calm confidence in her voice when she corrected his grammar. Most people reacted differently when they discovered who George was. Some became overly respectful. Others tried too hard to impress him. Catherine had done neither. She simply corrected a sentence and continued her work. George shook his head slightly, almost amused. Then he walked away toward the street. At the time, he assumed the moment would fade like countless other small encounters he experienced while traveling. But it didn't. 3 days later, George was still in Baltimore finishing business matters. And one evening, without planning it too carefully, he found himself walking down the same street near the harbor again. The restaurant windows glowed softly just as they had before. Inside, diners filled many of the tables. George paused outside the entrance. For a brief moment he considered choosing another place. But curiosity won. He stepped inside. The host looked up and smiled politely. "Good evening, sir." George nodded. "Evening." The host recognized him almost immediately from his earlier visit. "Welcome back." George gave a small shrug. "Dinner was good last time." The host led him toward a table near the same window. As George sat down, he glanced across the room. The restaurant was busy. Servers moved between tables carrying trays and checking orders. For a moment, he didn't see Catherine. Then she appeared near the kitchen doors, balancing several glasses on a tray. George noticed her immediately. She moved with the same calm rhythm as before, speaking briefly with another table before turning toward the center of the dining room. A few seconds later, Catherine looked in his direction. Her eyes paused on him for just a moment. Recognition appeared instantly. She raised an eyebrow slightly as she walked toward the table. "Well," Catherine said when she reached him, "I see the salmon made a strong impression." George laughed quietly. "It did." Catherine held her notepad casually. "Back for another language test?" George lifted both hands in surrender. "No tests tonight." Catherine smiled. "That's probably wise." She placed a glass of water in front of him. "So," she added, "are we ordering in English this time?" George leaned back in his chair. "Most likely." Catherine pretended to look relieved. "Good. My shift is long enough without surprise grammar quizzes." George chuckled. The conversation felt easy, natural, and for a moment, neither of them mentioned the first night again. But the memory of that small correction remained quietly present between them. George opened the menu, though he wasn't really reading it. "What do you recommend tonight?" he asked. Catherine tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well," she said, "if you want something safe, the salmon is still good." George smiled. "And if I want something adventurous?" Catherine tapped the edge of the menu lightly. "Then maybe try the chef's special." George nodded. "I'll take your advice." She wrote the order down quickly. Then Catherine paused before leaving. "You know," she said lightly, "most people who try that little language trick only do it once." George looked up. "What makes you think I was trying a trick?" Catherine's smile returned. "Because you looked a little too confident when you said it." George laughed again. "Fair point." She started walking away toward the kitchen. But before she reached the door, George spoke again. "Catherine." She turned back. "Yes?" George hesitated for just a second. Then he asked a question that surprised even himself. "How many languages do you actually speak?" Catherine studied him for a moment. Then she gave a small shrug. "Enough to keep people honest." And with that, she disappeared through the kitchen doors. George leaned back in his chair again. The curiosity that began 3 nights earlier had only grown stronger. And now he knew something for certain. This dinner wouldn't be his last visit to this restaurant. After long shifts at the restaurant, Catherine's routine rarely changed. When the final tables were cleared and the dining room quieted, she would untie her apron, gather her things, and step outside into the cool Baltimore night. The inner harbor at that hour felt peaceful. Streetlights reflected softly across the water. A few late-night walkers moved along the harbor path while distant traffic hummed beyond the waterfront. But Catherine's night didn't usually end there. Home was several miles away, in the neighborhood where she had grown up. Rows of brick houses lined the streets, each porch carrying signs of daily life. A pair of folding chairs near one doorway. Flower pots along another, someone's old radio playing music through an open window. It was the kind of neighborhood where people noticed when you arrived. On this particular evening, Catherine parked her car along the curb and stepped out just as laughter echoed from a nearby backyard. She didn't even need to check the address. The smell of grilled food already told her exactly where the gathering was happening. Family cookouts had always been a normal part of life in this neighborhood. Not scheduled weeks in advance, not formal events, just moments when someone decided to light the grill and the rest of the block slowly gathered. Catherine walked toward the backyard gate where music drifted through the air. Old-school R&B played from a small speaker sitting on a wooden table. A few people were gathered around folding chairs while others stood near the grill, talking and laughing between bites of food. As soon as Catherine stepped through the gate, someone spotted her. "Well, look who finally made it." Catherine smiled as she walked in. "Work ran late," she said. "That restaurant keeping you busy again?" Another voice called out, "Always." Someone handed her a plate before she could even ask. "You look like you need to eat." Catherine laughed softly. "Thank you." She sat down in one of the folding chairs while conversations continued around her. These gatherings were simple but comforting. No dress code, no expectations. Just people who had known each other long enough that conversation flowed easily. Music played. The grill crackled. Every so often someone shouted across the yard during a card game or told a story that caused the entire group to laugh. Catherine leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth of the moment settle around her. It felt different from the restaurant. There, everything moved with precision. Orders, schedules, professional smiles. Here, everything felt relaxed, natural. Someone nearby glanced over at Catherine with a playful grin. "So," the voice said, "you still correcting people at work?" Catherine looked up. "What do you mean?" "Oh, come on," the voice continued. "You're always catching people when they say something wrong. A few people laughed. Catherine shook her head. I don't go around correcting everybody. Sure you don't. The teasing tone was familiar. People here had known her long enough to recognize her habit of noticing details. Catherine took a bite of food before answering. Well, she said calmly, someone did try something interesting at the restaurant the other night. That caught attention. Oh, really? What happened? Catherine shrugged lightly. A customer ordered dinner in German. Someone raised an eyebrow. At a seafood restaurant? Exactly. So what did you do? Catherine smiled slightly. I took the order, and I corrected one word. The group burst into laughter. Of course you did. Catherine laughed with them. It wasn't a big deal. What did he say? Catherine thought for a moment before answering. He said Das Lachs. A voice from across the table responded immediately. And it's Den Lachs, right? Catherine nodded. Exactly. Someone leaned forward with curiosity. So what did the guy do when you corrected him? Catherine paused. She remembered George's expression when he realized what had happened. He looked surprised, she admitted. Well, I bet he did, someone said with a grin. People always assume things. Catherine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced around the backyard. The laughter, the music, the familiar faces. This was the environment that had shaped her confidence, not arrogance, just the quiet belief that a person's value had nothing to do with their job title. Her mother's voice echoed gently in her memory. Never let somebody make you feel small just because they don't know how big you are. Catherine smiled softly to herself. Someone nearby noticed. What's funny? Nothing, Catherine replied. She leaned back in her chair again while the conversation drifted to other topics. Music continued playing from the speaker. The grill sizzled with another round of food. People moved around the yard sharing stories and jokes. Moments like this reminded Catherine why she never felt embarrassed about where she came from. The warmth of community, the easy laughter, the way people supported each other without needing wealth or status to prove their worth. Across town, George's world looked very different. Elegant dining rooms, business meetings, quiet conversations about markets and investments. Yet if he had stepped into that backyard gathering, he might have noticed something he rarely experienced in those circles. Comfort, genuine connection. And as Catherine sat there listening to the music and laughter around her, she had no idea that the curious customer she mentioned earlier was already planning another visit to the restaurant. Over the next several days, George returned to the restaurant more than once. At first, he told himself it was simply because the food was good. Baltimore seafood had always been known for its quality, and the restaurant delivered meals that felt both comforting and carefully prepared. But George understood himself well enough to know that wasn't the real reason. His curiosity had grown. Each time Catherine approached the table, their conversations stretched a little longer. Nothing dramatic, just small exchanges between orders and plates leaving the kitchen. Yet those brief moments revealed pieces of Catherine's personality that George found increasingly interesting. She spoke thoughtfully. She listened carefully. And she never treated him any differently after learning who he was. One evening, as Catherine placed a plate in front of him, George looked up. Can I ask you something? He said. Catherine tilted her head slightly. You already are. George smiled. Fair enough. He paused for a second. Do you ever get tired of people making assumptions? Catherine considered the question while adjusting the edge of the plate. That depends, she said. On what? On whether they're willing to learn something new afterward. George leaned back slightly. That sounds like experience talking. Catherine shrugged. Restaurants teach you a lot about people. George chuckled. I believe that. For a moment the conversation paused as another table nearby called for Catherine's attention. I'll be right back, she said. George nodded. Take your time. While she stepped away, George glanced around the dining room. The familiar rhythm of the restaurant continued. But something inside him had changed since the first night. He wasn't simply observing the room anymore. He was paying attention to one person moving through it. When Catherine returned a few minutes later, George had finished most of his meal. She placed the check folder on the table. Whenever you're ready, George looked up at her. Do you get off soon? Catherine raised an eyebrow. That depends. On what? On whether the kitchen decides to send out a surprise rush of orders. George laughed softly. I see. A few minutes later he paid the bill. Catherine collected it and returned with a receipt. "Have a good night," she said. George hesitated before standing. Then he spoke again. "If you're not in a hurry after your shift, would you like to walk for a few minutes?" Catherine studied his expression. The request wasn't pushy, just straightforward. Outside the restaurant windows, the harbor lights shimmered across the dark water. After a moment, Catherine nodded. "All right," she said. "Give me about 15 minutes." George stepped outside while Catherine finished her shift. The night air near the harbor carried a cool breeze. Streetlights reflected along the walkway where a few people passed by quietly. George leaned against the railing overlooking the water, watching boats move slowly across the harbor. 15 minutes later, the restaurant door opened. Catherine stepped outside, now wearing a light jacket. "You waited," she said. George smiled. "I said I would." They began walking along the harbor path together. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The quiet rhythm of the water and distant sounds from nearby streets filled the space between them. Finally, Catherine glanced toward him. "So," she said, "what did you want to talk about?" George exhaled slowly. "Your languages." Catherine smiled slightly. "That topic again?" George nodded. "You mentioned studying linguistics." "I did." "What made you choose it?" Catherine looked out toward the harbor lights before answering. "I liked how languages connect people." George waited. "When you learn someone else's language," she continued, "you understand how they see the world." George nodded thoughtfully. "That's true." They walked a few more steps before George spoke again. "There's something I didn't mention before." Catherine glanced at him. "Oh." George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked the screen and turned it toward her. Catherine looked down. A website filled the display. Images of students, classrooms, international programs. "What is this?" she asked. "A foundation," George said, "for language education." Catherine looked back up. "You run this?" George nodded. "I started funding it several years ago." Catherine studied the screen again. "Scholarship announcements, cultural exchange programs, support for students studying linguistics. You help people study languages," she said quietly. George placed the phone back in his pocket. "Yes." Catherine stopped walking for a moment. The harbor lights reflected softly across the water beside them. "You're serious about this," she said. George met her eyes. "I am." Catherine folded her arms lightly. "So why show it to me?" George took a slow breath. "Because when you corrected that German sentence..." He paused. "It reminded me of something." "What?" "That people shouldn't have to give up dreams just because life interrupted them." Catherine didn't answer immediately. The breeze moved gently across the harbor. For years, the idea of returning to her studies had lived quietly in the back of her mind. Not forgotten, just pushed aside by responsibilities and time. Now, standing beside the water, someone was speaking about that possibility again. George's voice softened. "What if you finished what you started?" Catherine looked at him carefully. "You're serious?" George nodded. "Very." For a moment, neither of them spoke, because the conversation had reached something deeper than curiosity. A single corrected word had already changed how George saw Catherine. Now, something else was beginning to change too. And neither of them fully understood yet how much that small moment in the restaurant was about to shape their future. After that evening by the harbor, something between George and Catherine shifted, not in a dramatic way. There was no sudden announcement or moment where either of them said something that clearly defined the change. Instead, the shift appeared quietly through routine. George began returning to the restaurant more often. At first, it was once every few days, then twice in a single week. Eventually, his visits became frequent enough that the staff started noticing. When George entered the restaurant now, the host would greet him with a familiar smile. "Good evening again." George would nod politely before taking a seat near the same window overlooking the harbor. The routine felt comfortable, but inside the kitchen, small conversations began circulating. One evening, Catherine stepped through the kitchen doors to pick up a tray when she heard a voice from behind the counter. "Your German customer is back." Catherine glanced toward the dining room. "You mean George?" The voice chuckled. "Look at that. You even know his name now." Catherine rolled her eyes slightly, though a small smile appeared anyway. "He's just a regular customer." "Sure," the voice replied playfully. "A billionaire who keeps coming back to your section." Catherine picked up the tray carefully. "You're imagining things." The voice laughed again. Maybe. Catherine didn't respond. Instead, she pushed the kitchen door open and stepped back into the dining room. George was already seated at his usual table. He looked up when she approached. Well, Catherine said lightly, either you really like the food here, or you're running an experiment. George smiled. Maybe both. She placed a glass of water on the table. Should I prepare for another German sentence? George laughed. No language tests tonight. Catherine tilted her head slightly. That's probably for the best. Over time, their conversations began stretching beyond simple restaurant exchanges. When the dining room slowed during quieter hours, Catherine would pause beside the table for a few extra minutes. George often asked questions. Not superficial ones, thoughtful ones. What was your favorite language to study? He asked one evening. Catherine thought for a moment. German surprised me the most. How so? The structure, she explained. It forces you to think carefully about every sentence. George nodded slowly. That sounds like good training for life. Catherine smiled. Maybe. Another night, George asked about translation. Is it difficult to translate ideas between languages? Catherine leaned slightly against the back of a nearby chair. It depends. On what? Some words don't exist in other languages, she said. So translators have to understand the meaning behind the words, not just the words themselves. George considered that. That sounds more complicated than most people realize. It is, Catherine replied. But it's also fascinating. These conversations began changing the way George saw her. At first, he had been curious about the surprising moment when she corrected his grammar. Now, something deeper had replaced that curiosity. Respect. Catherine wasn't just someone who happened to know a foreign language. She thought deeply about the way people communicated, the way ideas moved between cultures, the way language shaped understanding. George found himself looking forward to those conversations, not because they were rare, but because they felt different from the discussions he usually had in business meetings. In those meetings, conversations were about numbers, growth projections, market trends. Here, conversations were about ideas, meaning, perspective. One evening, after Catherine finished explaining how certain expressions could not be translated directly into English, George shook his head slightly. You know something? Catherine raised an eyebrow. What? I've had dinner with professors who didn't explain language as clearly as you just did. Catherine laughed softly. That's because professors have time to prepare lectures. And you don't? No, she said with a small grin. I have tables to serve. George watched her for a moment. Then he said something honestly. You should be teaching. Catherine paused. For a brief moment, her expression softened. But she recovered quickly. Life doesn't always follow the plan we start with. George nodded slowly. I know. But in that moment, George realized something important. The woman serving dinner in front of him was someone the academic world might have valued far more than the restaurant industry ever could. And that realization made him see Catherine in an entirely new way. After the evening by the harbor, and after many dinners that turned into long conversations, George and Catherine had reached a point where their exchanges no longer felt like simple interactions between a customer and a server. Something else had formed. A familiarity, not rushed, not forced, just a steady rhythm of conversations that continued each time George visited the restaurant. One evening, the dining room was unusually calm. Only a few tables were occupied. Soft music drifted through the room while the kitchen worked at a relaxed pace. George had already finished most of his meal when Catherine returned with a glass of water. You look like you're thinking about something, she said. George smiled slightly. Is it that obvious? Catherine folded her arms lightly. You've been staring at the harbor for 5 minutes, George chuckled. Fair point. Catherine waited. What's on your mind? George hesitated for a moment before speaking. I have an event coming up. Catherine tilted her head. What kind of event? A charity dinner. Catherine nodded slowly. For your language foundation? Yes. She smiled faintly. That sounds important. George looked at her carefully. It is. Then he added something that made Catherine pause. I'd like you to come with me. Catherine blinked. Come with you? George nodded. As my guest. For a moment she didn't answer. Instead, she leaned slightly against the edge of the table, thinking about the invitation. You realize I work here, right? She said. George smiled. I'm aware. Catherine shook her head gently. George, People who attend events like that don't usually bring waitresses as their guests. George leaned forward slightly. They bring people they respect. Catherine studied his expression carefully. You're serious? I am. Catherine exhaled slowly. The idea felt unfamiliar. Her world and George's world were very different. She imagined elegant rooms filled with wealthy donors and polished conversations about international programs. People who traveled frequently. People who belonged in that environment. Meanwhile, her own life revolved around restaurant shifts, neighborhood gatherings, and balancing responsibilities that had delayed her academic path. You really think I belong at something like that? She asked quietly. George didn't hesitate. Yes. Catherine looked down at the table for a moment before responding. Sometimes people see the job first, she said slowly, and they stop there. George listened carefully. They don't ask about the person, Catherine continued. They don't ask about what that person studied or what they care about. George nodded. That happens a lot. Catherine looked back up. So, why invite me? George answered honestly. Because you belong in conversations about language and education more than most people I meet at those events. Catherine let out a soft laugh. You might be giving me too much credit. George shook his head. No. The sincerity in his voice made Catherine pause again. The dining room remained quiet around them. For a moment, the world outside the restaurant felt far away. George continued speaking. You've spent years studying linguistics. You understand translation, cultural context, and communication in ways that most donors at that dinner never will. Catherine smiled slightly. And yet, I'm still carrying plates every night. George leaned back in his chair. There's nothing wrong with honest work. I know that, Catherine said. But environments shape how people see you. George thought about that for a moment. Then he spoke calmly. Maybe it's time someone saw you in a different environment. Catherine remained silent for several seconds. The idea was intimidating, but it was also intriguing. Finally, she crossed her arms and looked directly at him. If I say yes, she said, you understand something. What's that? I'm not going to pretend to be someone else. George smiled. I wouldn't ask you to. And if someone there assumes something about me? George shrugged lightly. Then they'll learn something new. Catherine laughed quietly. That sounds familiar. George nodded. It should. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. All right. George raised an eyebrow. All right. I'll go. George smiled. Good. Catherine picked up the check folder from the table. But if this turns into another grammar test, she added playfully, I'm leaving early. George laughed. I promise no language tricks. As Catherine walked away toward the kitchen, George leaned back in his chair again. The invitation had felt natural to him, but he knew the evening ahead might reveal something important. Because when two different worlds meet in the same room, people often reveal more about themselves than they intend. Before we step into that dinner and what happened that night, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt underestimated because of your job, your background, or the way someone first judged you? If you have, take a moment to share your experience in the comments. And if stories like Catherine and George's remind you how powerful respect and opportunity can be, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Gray's Stories so you don't miss the next chapter. Because the night of that charity dinner was about to show everyone in the room exactly who Catherine really was. The night of the charity dinner arrived quietly. For George, events like this were routine. He had attended hundreds of gatherings that looked almost identical. Formal rooms, elegant tables, soft music drifting through conversations about philanthropy and business. But this evening felt different. Because this time, he wasn't arriving alone. Earlier that evening, George waited outside the restaurant near the inner harbor, the same place where he and Catherine had first met. The harbor lights reflected gently across the water while people walked along the waterfront path. A few minutes later, Catherine stepped outside. She had finished her shift and changed into a simple but elegant dress. Nothing extravagant, just something comfortable and neat. George smiled when he saw her. You look great, he said. Catherine gave a small shrug. I figured I should at least try not to embarrass you. George chuckled. That's not possible. They walked together toward the car waiting nearby. As they drove across the city, Catherine looked out the window at the familiar streets of Baltimore. So what exactly should I expect tonight? She asked. George thought for a moment. People who care about education, he said. And people who care about being seen caring about education. Catherine laughed softly. That sounds honest. George smiled. It is. The car stopped in front of a large waterfront building where the charity dinner was being held. Inside, the event hall glowed with warm light. Round tables covered with white cloth filled the room. Guests stood in small groups, speaking quietly, while servers carried trays of drinks between them. As George and Catherine stepped inside, several people immediately recognized him. A few nodded respectfully. Others approached briefly to greet him. But something else happened too. Some eyes shifted toward Catherine, curious, evaluating. George noticed it immediately, but Catherine remained calm. She had expected attention. What mattered was how she responded to it. George guided her toward one of the tables reserved near the front of the room. As they sat down, several nearby guests began casual conversation. One of them looked at Catherine with polite curiosity. "And what do you do?" the guest asked. Catherine smiled calmly. "I work at a restaurant." The answer created a brief pause. Not rude, just surprised. But Catherine continued speaking before the silence grew awkward. "I also studied linguistics." That changed the tone instantly. The same person leaned forward with interest. "Really?" Catherine nodded. "Yes." Another guest joined the conversation. "Linguistics is fascinating. Did you focus on a specific language?" "German was one of my strongest," Catherine replied. "What interested you about it?" someone asked. Catherine thought for a moment before answering. "I like how language reveals how people think." The table listened. "When you translate ideas between languages," she continued, "you realize that meaning isn't always tied to the exact words being used." George watched the conversation unfold quietly. At first, the guests had simply been polite. Now they were listening carefully. One person asked another question. "How does translation deal with expressions that don't exist in another language?" Catherine smiled. "That's where understanding culture becomes important." She explained how certain phrases required interpretation rather than direct translation, how meaning sometimes depended on context rather than grammar alone. The conversation continued. The guests who at first looked uncertain were now fully engaged. George leaned back slightly in his chair. He wasn't surprised. Catherine spoke about language with the same clarity she had shown during their conversations at the restaurant. But watching others discover that knowledge for the first time felt satisfying. One person eventually turned toward George. "You didn't mention Catherine studied linguistics," the guest said. George smiled slightly. "I didn't think I needed to." Across the table, Catherine laughed softly. "I think he just enjoys watching people realize things on their own." George shrugged. "Sometimes that's the best way to learn." The evening continued with speeches about education and international programs. Several presenters discussed the importance of language learning in global cooperation. Catherine listened carefully, occasionally exchanging thoughtful comments with the guests seated nearby. By the time dinner was served, the earlier curiosity about her presence had disappeared completely. Now the people at the table treated her like someone whose ideas were worth hearing. George glanced at Catherine for a moment. She looked comfortable, relaxed, as if she had belonged in that room all along. And in George's mind, one thought became very clear. The world had almost missed someone remarkable simply because life had temporarily placed her in the wrong environment. Later that evening, as the charity event began winding down, Catherine leaned toward George slightly. "So," she said quietly, "did I survive your charity dinner?" George smiled. "You did more than survive." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Oh." George nodded. "You reminded a room full of donors why language education actually matters." Catherine laughed softly. "Well, that's a good outcome." But for George, the evening had confirmed something even more important. The woman who corrected one German word in a restaurant had just proven that intelligence doesn't depend on where someone works, and anyone paying attention in that room had just learned the same lesson. As the charity dinner began to wind down, guests slowly moved away from the tables and toward the large windows overlooking Baltimore's harbor. Soft conversations replaced the earlier speeches. Waiters cleared plates while quiet music drifted through the hall. George noticed Catherine standing near the balcony doors, looking out toward the water. The harbor lights reflected gently across the surface, creating long, shimmering paths across the dark water. He walked over beside her. "Enjoying the view?" George asked. Catherine smiled slightly. "It's peaceful." For a moment they stood there quietly. The sounds of conversation behind them faded into the background. Catherine rested her hands lightly against the balcony railing. "Well," she said after a moment, "that was an interesting evening." George nodded. "You handled it well." Catherine glanced sideways at him. "You sound surprised." George chuckled. "Not surprised." He paused. "Just impressed." Catherine laughed softly. "I've had practice talking about languages." George looked out across the harbor again. Then his expression grew more thoughtful. "There's something I should probably admit," he said. Catherine raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." George took a slow breath. "Remember the first night we met?" Catherine smiled faintly. "The famous salmon order?" George laughed quietly. "Yes, that one." He leaned slightly against the railing. "I didn't speak German by accident." Catherine tilted her head. "I assumed that." George looked at her. "You did?" "Yes." George blinked. "Well, that makes this conversation easier." Catherine crossed her arms casually. "Go on." George sighed softly. "When I ordered in German, I assumed you wouldn't understand it." The honesty hung between them. George didn't try to soften the statement. He simply said it. Catherine nodded slowly. "I know." George looked surprised. "You know?" "Yes." Catherine looked back toward the water before continuing. "You weren't the first person to try something like that." George raised an eyebrow. "You mean people test you with foreign languages often?" Catherine smiled slightly. "Not often." She paused. "But often enough." George laughed under his breath. "Well, I guess I wasn't as original as I thought." Catherine turned toward him again. "No." Then she added calmly, "But you were polite about it." George nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." A moment neither of them spoke. Then George asked something he had wondered about since that first evening. "Why didn't you call me out for it?" Catherine shrugged lightly. "Because that wouldn't have taught you anything." George looked confused. "What do you mean?" Catherine smiled. "If I had told you directly that you were making an assumption, the conversation would have turned defensive." George thought about that. She continued, "But correcting one word?" She lifted one finger slightly. "That's enough to make someone rethink things." George laughed. "So you did it on purpose?" Catherine nodded. "Yes." George shook his head slowly. "That's actually brilliant." Catherine smiled again. "I just prefer quiet lessons." George leaned back against the railing. "You know something?" "What?" "That moment bothered me for days." Catherine looked amused. "Good." George laughed. "I deserved that." But his voice grew more serious again. "That correction made me realize something uncomfortable." Catherine listened. "I've always considered myself open-minded," George said. "But that night showed me I still carried assumptions I hadn't noticed." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "That happens to everyone." George looked at her. "But most people don't meet someone who quietly proves them wrong." The harbor breeze moved gently between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine said something that shifted the conversation slightly. "You know what the interesting part is?" "What?" "If you hadn't tried that little language test." George waited. "We probably never would have had a conversation beyond ordering dinner." George smiled. "That's true." Catherine looked back at the water again. "Funny how small moments can change everything." George followed her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. "They can." And in that moment, both of them understood something clearly. The evening they met had started with a simple assumption, but it had grown into something far more meaningful than either of them expected. After the charity dinner, something about the dynamic between George and Catherine shifted again, not because of the event itself, but because honesty had entered the space between them. George had admitted his assumption. Catherine had revealed she understood it from the beginning. Instead of creating distance, the truth had done the opposite. It had created trust. Over the next few weeks, George still visited the restaurant regularly, but their conversations slowly expanded beyond the walls of the dining room. One evening, after Catherine finished her shift, George stood outside near the harbor walkway waiting. When she stepped outside, she noticed him leaning against the railing. "You're becoming predictable," Catherine said with a small smile. George laughed. "I was hoping for reliable." Catherine adjusted her jacket. "What's the plan tonight?" George hesitated for a moment. Then he said something different from his usual invitations. I was wondering if I could see your side of Baltimore. Catherine raised an eyebrow. My side? George nodded. I've seen the harbor. I've seen the restaurants and business districts. But I've never seen the neighborhood where you grew up. Catherine studied his expression carefully. You sure about that? George smiled. Why wouldn't I be? Catherine shrugged lightly. It's not exactly the environment you're used to. George folded his arms. That's the point. Catherine thought for a moment. Then she smiled. Well, tonight might be your lucky night. George looked curious. Why? Catherine gestured toward the street. Because there's a cookout happening. George blinked. A cookout? Yes. She laughed softly. You're about to experience something far different from charity dinners. They drove across the city together until the tall waterfront buildings disappeared behind them. Soon the streets became quieter. Rows of brick houses lined both sides of the road. Front porches held folding chairs and small flower pots. A few porch lights glowed warmly against the evening sky. As they stepped out of the car, George heard music drifting down the block. Someone nearby had a speaker playing old-school R&B. The air carried the unmistakable smell of food cooking on a grill. Catherine smiled when she saw the backyard gate open. Right on time, George followed her inside. Several people were gathered around folding tables and lawn chairs. Some stood near the grill, while others laughed over a card game. The moment Catherine walked in, someone noticed her immediately. Well, look who showed up. Catherine waved casually. Hey. Then someone else spotted George. And who's this? Catherine glanced at George before answering calmly. This is George. George nodded politely. Good evening. For a moment, several people studied him with curiosity. But the atmosphere remained relaxed. Someone handed George a plate without asking. You can't stand here empty-handed, the voice said. George laughed. Thank you. Within minutes, George found himself sitting in a folding chair beside Catherine while conversations flowed around them. The atmosphere felt completely different from the charity dinner. Here, people spoke openly. Laughter came easily. Music played in the background, while the grill continued cooking more food. George leaned slightly toward Catherine. You were right. About what? This is very different. Catherine grinned. Better? George thought about it. Yes. He looked around the yard. No one seemed concerned about status or wealth. People simply enjoyed the evening. At one point someone called out toward Catherine. Your friend here play cards? George looked surprised. I'm not very good. That's all right, the voice replied. You'll learn. A few minutes later, George found himself sitting at a small table watching a lively card game. The rules were explained quickly. The players laughed whenever someone made a mistake. George lost several rounds, but he laughed along with everyone else. Later, as the evening settled into a calm rhythm, George leaned back in his chair beside Catherine. You know something? He said quietly. What? I don't think I've laughed this much in months. Catherine smiled. That's because no one here cares about how much money you have. George nodded slowly. I noticed. For a moment they both watched the gathering around them. The music, the laughter, the easy sense of belonging. George spoke again. I'm glad you showed me this. Catherine looked at him. This is my world, she said simply. George nodded. And it's a good one. Before the night ended, Catherine turned toward him with a thoughtful expression. You know, she said, people talk a lot about cultural exchange programs. George raised an eyebrow. Yes. Catherine smiled. Tonight might count as one. George laughed. I think you're right. Then he looked around the yard again. This might be the most honest environment I've been in all year. Catherine nodded. That's the thing about community. George glanced toward her. What's that? You don't have to prove anything to belong. The evening continued with more laughter and conversation, and as George sat there among people who had welcomed him without hesitation, he realized something important. Understanding another person's world sometimes begins with simply showing up and listening. Before we continue Catherine and George's story, think about this for a moment. Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to later realize you misunderstood them? If that's happened to you, share it in the comments, because moments like that remind us how much we still have to learn about each other. And George was about to learn one more important lesson about Catherine's future. After the cookout in Catherine's neighborhood, the connection between Catherine and George felt different again. Something deeper had formed. not because of grand gestures, but because each of them had now stepped into the other's world. George had seen Catherine in the place where she felt most at home, surrounded by laughter, music, and the easy warmth of community. Catherine had seen George in the environment where his influence mattered, rooms where decisions about education and opportunity shaped real lives. The distance between those two worlds no longer felt as large as it once had. A few nights later, Catherine finished her shift at the restaurant and stepped outside. George was waiting near the harbor railing again. "You're really making this a habit," she said with a small smile. George shrugged. "I enjoy the view." Catherine leaned beside him. "Or maybe you enjoy the conversations." George laughed. "That too." They walked slowly along the harbor path, the city lights reflecting across the calm water. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine broke the silence. "You know, something has been on my mind lately." George glanced toward her. "What's that?" Catherine rested her hands lightly in the pockets of her jacket. "That website you showed me. The foundation?" "Yes." George nodded. "What about it?" Catherine hesitated for a moment before answering. "I couldn't stop thinking about the students in those photos." George listened quietly. "They looked like they were exactly where they were supposed to be," she continued. "Studying what they love." George nodded slowly. "That's the goal." Catherine looked out toward the water again. "I used to picture that kind of life for myself." George knew what she meant. Her studies, linguistics, the academic path that had paused when life demanded something different. "You still can," George said gently. Catherine shook her head slightly. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" She laughed quietly. "George, I've been out of school for years. That doesn't mean you can't go back." Catherine turned toward him. "And just jump into classes again?" George met her eyes. "Yes." Catherine smiled, but there was hesitation behind it. "It's easy for you to say." George frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You live in a world where opportunities appear quickly." Catherine's voice remained calm, not bitter. "My world doesn't work like that." George considered her words carefully. "You think I don't understand that?" "I think you want to help," Catherine said gently. "But going back to school would mean rearranging my entire life." George leaned slightly against the railing. "You've already rearranged your life before." Catherine looked at him. "When your mother needed help," George continued, "you stepped forward." Catherine didn't respond immediately. "That wasn't a choice," she said quietly. George nodded. "I know." Then he spoke again. "But finishing your education could be." The harbor breeze moved softly between them. Catherine watched the lights reflecting across the water. For years, she had placed that dream aside. Not because it stopped mattering, but because practical responsibilities came first. Yet recently, something had changed. The conversations with George, the charity dinner, the reminder that the passion she once had for linguistics still lived somewhere inside her. "I wouldn't even know where to start," she admitted. George smiled slightly. "That part is easy." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" "Yes." George pulled his phone from his pocket again. "You remember the foundation website?" "Of course." "Well," he said calmly, "we support students returning to school, too." Catherine looked at him carefully. "You're serious?" George nodded. "I wouldn't have mentioned it if I wasn't." She folded her arms. "So what exactly are you offering?" George answered honestly. "Support. Financial support?" "Yes." Catherine looked down for a moment. "That sounds generous." George noticed the hesitation. "But," Catherine sighed softly, "I don't want charity." George shook his head immediately. "It's not charity. What is it then?" George smiled. "An investment." Catherine looked skeptical. "In what?" "In someone who already proved she belongs in that field." Catherine studied his expression for several seconds. "You really believe that?" "I do." The quiet confidence in George's voice made the moment feel heavier, because this time the opportunity wasn't abstract. It was real, and Catherine knew accepting it would mean stepping back toward a dream she had once believed was gone. Finally she spoke again. "I'd have to think about it." George nodded. "That's fair." Catherine looked at him carefully. "You're patient, aren't you?" George smiled. "I've learned that important decisions shouldn't be rushed." Catherine glanced back at the harbor. For the first time in years, the idea of returning to school didn't feel impossible. It felt possible. And sometimes the most powerful change in a person's life doesn't begin with action. It begins with the quiet realization that a door you thought was closed might still be waiting for you to walk through it. The decision did not happen overnight. For several days after the conversation by the harbor, Catherine carried the idea quietly in her mind. Returning to school, finishing the path she once started. The thought appeared whenever she drove home after a late shift at the restaurant. It appeared when she sat alone during short breaks between tables. And sometimes it appeared late at night when the city outside her window had gone quiet. For years, Catherine had convinced herself that chapter of her life had already closed. Responsibilities had changed the direction of her plans. Helping her mother had mattered more than personal ambition, and she had never regretted that choice. But now something had shifted, not because George had pushed her. In fact, George had done the opposite. After offering support through the foundation, he had not mentioned the subject again. Instead, he allowed Catherine space to think. That patience mattered, because the decision had to come from her. One evening, Catherine stood near the harbor again after finishing her shift. George leaned against the railing beside her. They watched the water quietly for several minutes before Catherine finally spoke. "I filled out the application today." George turned toward her. "You did?" Catherine nodded. "Yes." George smiled slowly. "How does it feel?" Catherine thought about the question. "Strange," she admitted. "Why strange?" "Because it feels like stepping back into a life I paused years ago." George nodded. "But also exciting." Catherine smiled slightly. "Yes." Several weeks later, Catherine walked across a college campus carrying a small notebook and a bag of textbooks. The morning air felt cool and fresh. Students moved between buildings in small groups, talking and laughing as they hurried toward their classes. For a moment, Catherine paused near the entrance of the linguistics department. The building looked familiar. The quiet hallways, the bulletin boards covered with announcements about lectures and research projects. Years earlier, she had walked through similar halls with confidence. Now she took a slow breath before stepping inside. Her first class back focused on translation theory. As Catherine sat down among the other students, she noticed something interesting. Many of them were younger. Some had just graduated from high school. Others were still adjusting to their first semesters of college life. Catherine felt slightly different sitting among them, not out of place, just aware that she had lived through experiences they had not yet faced. When the lecture began, the professor started discussing the complexity of translating meaning between languages. The topic immediately captured Catherine's attention. As the discussion progressed, the professor asked a question. How do translators handle expressions that have no direct equivalent in another language? Several students offered tentative answers. Then Catherine raised her hand. She described how cultural context shaped interpretation, how translators often had to understand the emotion behind a phrase rather than its literal wording. The professor listened carefully before nodding. "That's a strong explanation." Catherine felt a quiet sense of confidence return. After class ended, she stepped outside into the sunlight again. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a message from George. "How was the first day?" Catherine smiled as she typed her reply. "Challenging, interesting, worth it." Moments later, another message appeared. "I had no doubt." The weeks that followed required discipline. Catherine still worked several shifts at the restaurant each week. During the day, she attended classes. At night, she studied. Some evenings, she met George near the harbor after long study sessions. They sat together with coffee while Catherine reviewed notes or discussed the ideas she had learned that week. The schedule was demanding, but Catherine never complained, because for the first time in years, she felt something that had been missing from her life: momentum. She was moving forward again, step by step, and each day she spent in the classroom reminded her of something important. Dreams do not always disappear when life interrupts them. Sometimes they simply wait for the right moment to begin again. As Catherine settled into her new routine of classes, studying, and restaurant shifts, the rhythm of her life began to change in quiet but meaningful ways. The days were fuller now. Morning lectures, afternoons spent reading through translation exercises and linguistic analysis. Evenings often returned her to the restaurant where she still worked part-time. But somewhere between those responsibilities, another part of her life continued growing. Her connection with George. Their conversations had once happened across a restaurant table while Catherine balanced orders and trays. Now they happened in many different places across Baltimore. Sometimes they met along the harbor after Catherine finished class. Other evenings, George joined her for coffee near campus while she reviewed notes between assignments. Their discussions still revolved around language often, but they expanded into other areas as well. Books, history, travel, even simple observations about how people interacted with each other in everyday situations. One afternoon, Catherine sat outside the campus library with a stack of textbooks spread across the table. George arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you could use this," he said as he placed one beside her notebook. Catherine smiled. "You're becoming very helpful." George sat down across from her. "Studying looks exhausting." Catherine laughed softly. "It's not exhausting." She glanced down at the open pages filled with notes. "It's challenging." George studied the diagrams in her notebook. "You make it look complicated." "It is complicated," Catherine replied, "but that's what makes it interesting." George nodded thoughtfully. "You're in your element." Catherine paused. Then she smiled again. "I think I am." Moments like this revealed something new about George as well. Before meeting Catherine, his life had been filled mostly with business meetings and investment strategies. Those environments valued speed and efficiency, but Catherine's academic world operated differently. Ideas were examined carefully. Concepts were debated thoughtfully. George found himself slowing down during their conversations, listening more, thinking more deeply about subjects he had once considered abstract. One evening as they walked along the harbor path, George spoke about it. "You've changed the way I look at conversations." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "In business meetings," George explained, "people focus on winning arguments. And now I'm more interested in understanding the argument." Catherine smiled. "That's progress." George laughed. "You sound like a professor." "Maybe someday," Catherine replied. Their relationship grew naturally, not through dramatic declarations, but through shared experiences that gradually built trust and understanding. George attended one of Catherine's university lectures one afternoon when the class allowed visitors. He sat quietly in the back of the room while Catherine participated in a discussion about cross-cultural communication. Watching her speak confidently among other students made George feel something unexpected: pride. Later, as they walked outside together, Catherine noticed his thoughtful expression. "What's that look for?" she asked. George shrugged lightly. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "You belong in that classroom." Catherine laughed softly. "I'm glad you think so." George looked at her seriously. "No, I mean it." Catherine noticed the sincerity in his voice. "You know something?" she said. "What?" "A year ago, I would have never imagined my life looking like this." George nodded slowly. "Neither would I." Their lives had begun in very different places. George grew up surrounded by privilege and opportunity. Catherine's path had been shaped by responsibility and sacrifice. But somehow those 2 paths had crossed at exactly the right moment. And the more time they spent together, the clearer something became. George admired Catherine's resilience. Catherine respected George's willingness to learn and change. That mutual respect created a foundation stronger than simple attraction. One evening as they watched the sunset over the harbor, Catherine spoke quietly. "You know what's strange?" "What?" George asked. "If you hadn't walked into that restaurant that night." George smiled. "We wouldn't be here." Catherine nodded. "All because of one sentence in German." George laughed. "I'm glad my grammar mistake turned out useful." Catherine grinned. "It definitely got your attention." They both looked out across the water again. The city lights began turning on as evening settled over Baltimore, and in that moment, both Catherine and George understood something quietly powerful. Their connection had started with curiosity, but over time, curiosity had grown into something deeper. Something built on respect, trust, and the shared belief that people are capable of far more than the roles life temporarily places them in. And the best part of their story was still waiting ahead. Months passed. Catherine's life settled into a steady rhythm that once seemed impossible. Classes during the day, research assignments that stretched into late evenings, occasional shifts at the restaurant where her journey with George had first begun. But the most important change wasn't just her schedule. It was the confidence that had returned to her voice. The same curiosity that once led her to study linguistics had awakened again. Now, it appeared in every discussion, every assignment, every classroom conversation. One afternoon, Catherine prepared for something important. Her first major academic presentation since returning to school. The lecture hall filled slowly with students and faculty members taking their seats. At the back of the room, George entered quietly and sat down. He didn't want to draw attention. He simply wanted to listen. When Catherine stepped to the front of the room, she carried a small stack of notes in one hand. For a brief moment she paused. Then she looked out across the room. Years earlier, this environment had been familiar. Now, returning to it carried deeper meaning. She began speaking. Her presentation focused on cultural interpretation and translation. She explained how certain phrases carry emotional meaning that cannot always be transferred directly between languages. Instead, translators must understand the culture behind the words. The discussion moved through examples drawn from German and English. Catherine spoke clearly, breaking down ideas in ways that made the subject accessible even for those who had never studied linguistics before. George listened carefully from his seat. He noticed the way the room responded. People leaned forward. They nodded as she explained complex ideas in simple language. The same clarity he had noticed during their conversations at the restaurant now filled the entire room. When Catherine finished, the room grew quiet for a moment before applause followed. She smiled modestly as she gathered her notes. Later, outside the lecture hall, George waited near the entrance. Catherine stepped outside and spotted him immediately. "You came," she said. "Of course," George replied. "Well?" she asked. George smiled. "You were impressive." Catherine laughed softly. "That's a polite way of saying I didn't embarrass myself." George shook his head. "No, you did exactly what you're meant to do." They began walking slowly across campus. Students passed by on their way to other classes, while the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalks. Catherine looked thoughtful. "You know something?" "What?" George asked. "If you had asked me 2 years ago where my life would be today, I would have given a completely different answer." George nodded. "Life changes direction sometimes." "Yes," Catherine said, "but sometimes it changes direction because someone believes in you." George smiled slightly. "You believed in yourself first." Catherine considered that. Maybe. They stopped near the edge of the campus, where the view opened toward the distant skyline of Baltimore. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then George said something quietly. "Do you remember the first night we met?" Catherine laughed. "How could I forget? The famous salmon order," George added. Catherine shook her head. "You really thought I wouldn't understand that sentence." George chuckled. "I know." Catherine looked at him. That one word changed everything. George nodded slowly. "Yes, sometimes people assume they understand someone after only a few seconds. A job title, a uniform, a quick glance across a room. But a person's real story often lives far beyond those first impressions." Catherine's story proved that. A waitress with a paused dream, a billionaire with an untested assumption. One sentence in a foreign language brought their worlds together. And the lesson that followed was simple. Never underestimate someone based on the moment you meet them, because intelligence often speaks quietly. And sometimes the person you overlook today might be the person who changes your perspective tomorrow. Before this story ends, take a moment to think about something. What is the biggest lesson life has taught you so far? Share it in the comments. And if stories like this remind you how powerful respect, curiosity, and opportunity can be, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Mr. Gray Stories. Because the next story might begin with a moment just as small and just as powerful as a single corrected word.